Good afternoon, happy Thursday, and welcome to a Browning Gate vlog. As a quick programming note, it has occurred to me that I have not done any dedicated vlog videos in quite some time. Those of you, at least, who have not been paying attention to the podcast, that is. So I would like to take this time to plug the podcast. If you've been skipping those videos just because the thumbnail looks boring, don't, because these last couple of years I've been trying to make it a habit of funneling more of the vlog-esque content into the X-Bulletin podcast. Now, because the overarching scope of the podcast is the subject of mobility and stories, there are certain topics that are difficult for me to be able to fit under that umbrella, for lack of a better term. But there are certain things, especially when they've been in my editing folder for this long as the video that you're watching right now has, that have evolved and flipped and changed so many times, that are beyond the scope of mobility or stories or mobility stories, where I just have to stop and deliver it in this format, because this is actually my third attempt at doing this video over the course of probably 5 years now. There are 2 Word document manuscripts that never got narrated because of, well, the events that I'm about to explain here. This is really less of a video, and I'll just tell you right off the bat, it's about the Toshiba 72MX195 DLP rear projection television. And even if you find that topic boring, I know I've covered a lot of display devices on the channel in the past, but this is really, more than anything else, a story about failure and a story about learning. And so I feel like there are at least some useful tidbits that we can glean from going over this together. And part of this is my own making. The results that you see in the videos, especially from many years ago, are curated by me to portray a certain level of success at these various different repair projects. Even the ones that took some unexpected turns along the way, such as the RCA HD61 LPW42. I'll just double check that model number, but I think I got that right. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. That was one where there were multiple things that were broken, and the solution eluded me for a time, but I was ultimately successful. That project had a good beginning, middle, and end. There was a good story and a good video to be made about it. I sold that thing maybe for some semblance of profit, but it was an interesting story. Similar for the 65-inch Mitsubishi, the WSA65. That was one where the thing really didn't need much in the way of repair, but my impatience ended up creating a coolant leak, which I then had to fix by investing more than what the thing was worth into getting a new power supply board, because I didn't really have any good leads on fixing the power supply board. And then another even more precarious or perhaps dangerous example of this was the 52-inch Mitsubishi DLP from actually way back in the beginning that I got alongside the Toshiba, the 52-inch Toshiba, where I tried to repair it, I couldn't, but then I realized that there was a warranty program as the result of some kind of settlement that somebody had with Mitsubishi, so they brought the warranty out a bunch of years beyond what it otherwise would have been, and I was able to get it fixed professionally by kind of fudging the warranty process, and I narrowly was able to get that done. But then there are other things that perhaps these types of successes set the bar too high for. I think there are, in really in any area of life, if people have too much beginner's luck, then it gives them a false sense or a false confidence in being able to do certain things. And such, I think, was the case with the 72-inch Toshiba. This is the last rear projection television that I've owned or been involved with in some way. And it's not really even that exciting of a story, but I think it teaches some important lessons similar to what we already talked about with the 2 Mitsubishis and the RCA. So extend to me some forgiveness here. This thing, as with many of my misadventures here on the channel, started out as a Craigslist freebie back in, I'm going to say 2018, but I'll have to go back to my original manuscripts to double check that. and it was actually working at the time when I got it. Now, right off the bat, there were a few things about it that I didn't like, even though this was arguably a much fancier piece of equipment than the 72HM84 that I had done all those years back. For starters, this one had a lot of digital functionality, a lot of fancy on-screen menus and guide, but for whatever reason, a few things just never felt right about it. For starters, the image was very soft. This is easily the softest digital display device that I have ever owned. This is one that really never felt right, even right out of the starting gate. And I'll give you a few examples. The lamp access door thumb screw was gone, and it was replaced with some random wood screw, which didn't really interface with the plastic receiver very well. Opening up the back of it, there were certain things with regard to the cable routing and some of the foil covers and stuff in certain places that made me think that this had been serviced at some point in the past. And beyond that, without getting into the technical details of it, this was one of those DLPs that used what some vendors referred to as wobulation, where it had, I believe, only half of either the horizontal or the vertical pixels, but the chip was fast enough that a second mirror would actually modulate the image either back and forth or up and down slightly to recreate the missing detail. And I want to say that it wasn't the fault of that technique because the image was sharp on the right third of the screen, or it was at least acceptably sharp to my eyes. So I was never really happy with the focus of the image. It wasn't something that could be adjusted. Even after I got a legitimate first party genuine Toshiba Phoenix lamp for the thing, it was bright, but it wasn't dazzlingly bright like I remembered the 52HM84 to be. Now, with that said, there have been quite a few years that had passed between the 52HM84 and my ownership of the 72MX195, so it's very, very possible that I just misremembered it. In fact, that it's more likely than not, at least slightly, that that's how it happened. But between that and the fact that it was kind of slow and it couldn't do PIP in the same way that the Mitsubishi could, and the sound system was kind of disappointing even though it was this fancy 6-speaker array that was supposed to be even more powerful than it, I never really liked it. And in fact, this is something that I would compare perhaps to, at least in terms of the most recent videos, things that I've shared, the iPhone X and the MacBook Pro, but for different reasons maybe. The iPhone X, I think, fits this example better, so we'll focus on that for right now. Years ago, when I was already looking at the prospect of replacing the Motorola Moto X Pure Edition with a different device, I had actually explored the possibility of going to iPhone. And at the time, I had a spreadsheet of different things that my primary mobile device had to be able to meet in terms of requirements. And the iPhone X, with the exception of it being a little bit on the small side, met pretty much all of those criteria. So when I got the chance to use one and own one as a secondary device for myself, I was very optimistic that this might actually be a good experience. What I was expecting going in was that I would think that the device was kind of ugly, but I would like it enough and find it to be stable enough that the only thing I wouldn't really like would be the smallness of the device, so I'd be able to get something like an XS Max, for example, because at the time the prices on those were reasonable on eBay for a used device by standards of iPhone. And what I found through using the devices was actually surprisingly frustrating in every regard. Not because the hardware was bad, I was actually quite impressed by the hardware overall. In fact, very impressed. If you watch the video, I really don't have much negative to say about the hardware, except that the device is just a little bit on the small side and the marketing kind of exaggerated the size of the screen, but we knew all that going in with that goofy shape. It was just everything about iOS. I had been conditioned by so many years using Android to expect everything to be easy to use and to work effectively, and then going to iOS and being jarred by everything being a pain in the ass, nothing being straightforward or intuitive, and the operating system fighting the user at every single step sullied the experience to some extent. And I think the Toshiba was like this too. It was the largest rear projection anything I had ever owned. It looked pretty. It was the high-end product, all the features. This was something that really should have been a slam dunk. The only naysayers were, you know, like the infamous smoky room whiny Toshiba guy on YouTube from like 2008. But I thought I had proved him wrong in the 52HM84 video. And for the most part, I still think I was right, but I will give him that for the context of the 72MX195 because that just wasn't a great product. I'll continue the story here now that we've completed this ridiculous digression into my unrelated story about the iPhone X. After procuring the Toshiba 72MX195, putting a legit lamp into it, cleaning it out, and cleaning the remote and putting it into service, it worked pretty well for a time. And then it started getting kind of rumbly. What do I mean by rumbly? Well, sometimes it would just growl. And by that, I mean that it was fairly obvious that the bearings in the color wheel or something mechanical related to the color wheel was having trouble. So the first thing I did is I carefully extracted the color wheel and then cleaned it and then put it back together. And that worked for a time, but then it started growling again. So I looked around and I believe I spent quite a bit of time researching the process of finding a color wheel that would actually work in this thing. And I did find one. I purchased it and then I was able to install it, put the thing back together again. But unfortunately, because I wasn't careful enough putting the metal shroud over the color wheel, I managed to completely slice the ribbon cable for it in half. So then I had to buy and install another color wheel. And it worked great. And in fact, we got probably a good couple of years of service out of it. I think 2018 to 2020, it was what I would consider to be a primary display device in this household. In terms of accomplishments on it, I was able to finish the entirety of the game's Singularity for Xbox 360 on it. So it wasn't impossible to game on. There was a little bit of lag, but it wasn't insurmountable. Finally, in 2020, it suffered catastrophic light engine failure. Not mechanical light engine failure in the same way that the RCA did all those years back. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, I strongly recommend you watch that video because that is probably one of the most interesting repair stories that I've ever told on this channel. But in the case of the Toshiba, the failure was a lot less interesting, a lot less amusing, and not really something that was within my capabilities to repair. I'll just put up a picture here of what it ended up looking like. The thing would basically freeze up shortly after powering on, and the image that it did displayed when it was in the frozen up state would be very distorted. It would be like wrapped around the edge. The coloration was weird. It was just all kinds of goofed up, basically. And unfortunately, this was something that the forums weren't able to help out with. There's only, as far as I know, one person online who knows how to fix this, and it was a person who operated an eBay service to fix this particular problem. And the asking price for that, I believe at the time, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 to $200, and since that exceeded the market value of a 72-inch DLP rear projection in the year 2020, I decided, after trying to sell it as is for a reasonable price for quite a few months, that I would part it out. And this was actually the first time I've ever had to part something out like this. So it was a bit of a sad experience. I did end up selling the light engine as is to somebody who needed a optical part off of it, since the entire optical block in it was still good. But my misfortune continued even in the parting out of the rest of it, because when I sold the electrical chassis, the buyer opted to initiate a fraudulent return, which I had to accept, so I lost out on quite a bit of money doing that. The rest of the parts I wasn't really able to do a whole lot with. The casing I had to trash. Some of the other little odds and ends, like the power cord and stuff, that can be recycled. The ferrite cores, those are actually one thing that can be used elsewhere for like audio and stuff. if I ever remember to put them into service, that is. But then stuff like face plates and the speakers, they're like, well, they're still intact and useful. I don't want to really throw them out, but there's not a whole lot of market interest in them either. The large piece of this that still remains is the mirror, and that I do have for sale locally, because I figure there's got to be somebody who's doing some kind of a projection-based project who can use a first surface projection mirror. For those of you who aren't familiar, first surface projection mirrors are different from bathroom mirrors in that the thing that the light hits is actually the mirror. Your bathroom mirror has a layer of glass in front of it, so if you actually did try to use a projector to shoot an image off of it onto something else, you would get the reflected image, but you would also get a shadow image slightly off from it, because the image would be projecting or would be reflecting not only off the mirror but also off of the glass in front of the mirror, which is why when using mirrors with projectors, they have to be of the first surface variety. I don't feel like trashing that just yet. I mean, I could. It would be very easy to dispose of if I wanted to. It's one of those things where I'm holding out hope that I can get a buyer or find a use for it. So all that to say, this is one of those examples where there was technically a successful repair in here somewhere. And I even recorded a video back before I knew this was going to turn into a whole hubbub of trying to figure out if I could get a external 1394 hard drive to work with it, because it had a 1394 input. And I happen to have this external hard drive laying around, so I wanted to see if it was actually functional in that regard, if I could actually record something to it and be able to, hook up a game console and get footage that way without having to use a capture card. And what I found was I could not get it to work. I would be, in fact, surprised if anybody could. I tried formatting the drive every way I could. I tried leaving it unformatted to see if maybe the Toshiba would be nice enough to try and do the formatting for me, but at no point was I able to have success at this. I think it might have been possible for either standard def or analog video capture for it to be able to put something on that drive, but that would be, in this day and age, of very limited utility since all my video sources are going to be digital and high def. So that was an adventure that I didn't really get a chance to share in any kind of meaningful way. So this is a story that started with high expectations and ended with, at best, disappointment, because I was not able to see this through a complete service life, at least in my opinion. It definitely failed long before it arguably should have. And that's in light of all the good luck that I had with every other projector and DLP rear projection and even CRT rear projections that I've ever had the privilege of being able to work with. So perhaps the grouchy Toshiba guy on YouTube was right, but only just this once and only for this particular model. To conclude, whether it's the podcast, whether it's vlog formatted feature videos, or the full-on scripted originals, I'm proud to be able to continue to make the videos and the podcasts that you actually want to watch and listen to, not just the ones that you're supposed to want to watch and listen to. As always, I'm your host, Browningate. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me for the next one.